You ever get that feeling something's off, but you just can't put your finger on it? That's how it started. We weren't expecting anything crazy that night. Jake and I were just hanging out at the farm, like we did most weekends. It was my uncle's place, but since he passed, Jake had been handling things on his own. The farm wasn't huge, just a few cows, chickens, and of course Rosie the pig. Rosie was big, even for a pig, but she wasn't some monster or anything. She was always a bit on the mean side, but pigs can be like that, especially when they get older. Anyway, the sun was starting to set, and we were wrapping up, thinking about what to eat for dinner, when we noticed something wasn't right. "Where's Rosie?" I asked, looking around the pen. Jake shrugged, not too worried. "She probably wandered off. Gate's been acting funny lately. Shouldn't we look for her?" I wasn't really concerned, just thinking about the trouble we'd be in if she damaged something. Pigs that size don't exactly tiptoe around. "Nah," Jake said, leaning against the fence, like he couldn't care less. "She'll come back. She always does." I remember thinking that maybe he was right. It's not like she could have gone far, and the sun was almost gone. No point searching in the dark. But just as I was about to follow Jake back into the house, I heard something. A noise, faint but weird, coming from near the barn. It wasn't a squeal, not really. It was lower, almost like a growl. I turned, squinting into the shadows, but couldn't see anything. Just the outline of the barn, the trees swaying a little in the wind, and the sky turning that deep purple color it gets right before nightfall. "Did you hear that?" I asked, feeling a little chill run down my back. Jake paused, looking over his shoulder. "Hear what?" "That noise. I swear I heard something by the barn." He laughed, shaking his head. "Man, you're jumpy. I'm telling you, Rosie's probably just rooting around somewhere." I didn't say anything, but I knew I heard something. It wasn't just the wind. There was movement, too. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was out there. We went back inside, had dinner, and tried to ignore it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Jake was already half asleep on the couch when I glanced out the window, and that's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a tree swaying in the wind. But then it moved again, closer to the barn. It was tall, too tall to be Rosie. The shape was weird, almost like a person, but stretched thin, way too thin. My stomach knotted up as I kept watching. Whatever it wasn't human, and it sure as hell wasn't a pig. "Jake," I whispered, trying not to sound freaked out. "Jake, get up," he groaned, rolling over. "What now?" There's something outside." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, looking annoyed. "You're serious?" "I'm serious, man. Come look." Reluctantly, he dragged himself over to the window, peered out, and frowned. "I don't see anything." "It was right there, by the barn," I insisted, feeling stupid but scared at the same time. "Probably just a deer or something," Jake muttered, but I could tell he wasn't sure. "Come on, let's check it out." I wasn't thrilled about going outside, but I couldn't back down. Jake grabbed a flashlight, and we headed out into the cold. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees, and everything felt quieter than usual. Too quiet, like the whole world was holding its breath. We circled the barn, shining the light into every corner, but nothing was there. Just empty darkness and the distant sound of leaves rustling. The shape I'd seen was gone. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe it had been a tree or a trick of the light. "You're imagining things," Jake said, turning to head back. Maybe he was right, but something in me didn't feel settled. As we started walking away, I heard that noise again, the same low growl, closer this time. I whipped around, shining the flashlight at the barn. The beam caught something just for a second, a flash of movement, tall and thin, slinking into the trees. "Jake!" I yelled, my voice cracking. But when he turned back, it was gone. Nothing but the wind again. "What the hell, man?" Jake said, stepping toward the trees. "You're freaking out over nothing." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't just a figment of my imagination. Something was watching us. Something wrong. We went back inside, locking the door behind us. Jake didn't say much after that, just mumbled something about getting some sleep. But I stayed up, sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness, waiting. Rosie still hadn't come back, and I couldn't help but wonder if she ever would. That was the night everything changed. I didn't know it then, but whatever had gotten loose in the farm wasn't just a pig anymore. Something else had taken its place, and it wasn't done with us. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I hadn't slept much after the weirdness of the night before. Every little sound kept me on edge, and I couldn't stop thinking about that shadow I saw by the barn. It had to be something real, I kept telling myself. I wasn't just imagining it. But when daylight came and the house was quiet, I started feeling kind of stupid for being so freaked out. Maybe it was just a deer like Jake said. Rosie still hadn't shown up by breakfast though. Jake was acting like it was no big deal, but I could tell he was getting worried. Pigs like her don't just vanish. They either come back for food, or you find them tearing up someone's yard. She'll turn up, Jake said between bites of toast. Probably wandered off to the neighbor's field. She does that sometimes. Shouldn't we go look for her? I asked, trying to sound casual, but really I just wanted to get outside and check around. If she messes with the crops, we're going to be in trouble. Jake sighed and put his plate down. All right, we'll take a drive around, see if we can find her. We jumped in Jake's old truck and drove around the property, calling her name, though I knew that was pointless. Pigs don't come when you call, especially not one as ornery as Rosie. After about an hour of nothing, we started heading back, and that's when we heard the news. We stopped by the general store to grab some supplies, and old man Thompson was there, telling everyone about the accident he'd had that morning. He was sitting on the front porch, his face pale, hands still trembling like he hadn't quite shaken off whatever had scared him. "Truck's done for," Thompson muttered, shaking his head. "Ran it right off the road. Lucky I didn't kill myself." Jake and I exchanged a glance. Thompson wasn't exactly known for his driving, but the man had been around long enough to handle himself on those country roads. "What happened?" Jake asked, trying not to sound too curious, but I could tell he was listening close. Thompson scratched his chin, eyes darting between us and the ground, like he was struggling to find the words. "I don't know what I saw," he finally said, his voice low. "But I swear to you, there was something in the road. It wasn't no deer, neither. It was standing upright. Tall, thin. Looked like a person, but not right." My stomach turned as soon as he said that. Tall and thin. That's exactly what I saw the night before. I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. Truck spun right off the road and hit a ditch. When I looked up again, that thing was gone, like it just vanished into thin air. Jake raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, but he didn't laugh it off this time. "You sure you weren't just seeing things, old man?" Thompson scowled. "I know what I saw, boy. And whatever it was, it didn't belong on that road." I wanted to ask him more, to tell him what I saw last night, but something held me back. I didn't want to sound crazy, and the way Jake was looking at me, I could tell he wasn't buying it either. But deep down, I knew there was a connection. The thing I saw by the barn, whatever it was, had to be the same thing Thompson saw. We headed back to the farm in silence, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Jake didn't say much for the rest of the day. He kept himself busy with chores, fixing fences and checking on the animals, while I couldn't stop thinking about what Thompson said. As the sun started to set again, that uneasy feeling from the night before crept back in. The wind picked up, the trees rustled, and everything felt too still. Rosie was still missing, and I couldn't shake the thought that whatever was out there, whatever Thompson had seen, had something to do with her disappearance. Later that night, Jake and I were sitting on the porch, just staring out into the distance. It was one of those nights where the stars were barely visible, and the moonlight wasn't doing much to light up the place. We both heard it at the same time, the sound of something moving through the trees near the edge of the property. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Jake nodded, squinting into the darkness. "Yeah, sounded like it's coming from the woods." I grabbed the flashlight, but Jake put a hand on my arm. "Wait, don't. Let's see if it comes closer." For a moment, we both sat there, frozen, listening. The sound of rustling grew louder, but it was too far away to see what was making it. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I had the overwhelming feeling that we weren't alone. Then, just like that, it stopped. Silence. Not even the wind. Jake let out a breath, trying to laugh it off, but I could hear the nervousness in his voice. "Probably just an animal." "Yeah," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Probably," but that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow again. Tall, thin, lurking by the barn. And now I had Thompson's words echoing in my head, making it impossible to shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. By morning, Rosie still hadn't come back. Jake shrugged it off, saying she'd show up eventually, but I could see the doubt creeping into his face. We didn't talk about the noises or what Thompson said, but we both knew something wasn't right. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just an ordinary animal. And if it wasn't Rosie, then what the hell was it? A few days passed, and Rosie was still nowhere to be found. Jake kept saying she'd show up, but I knew better. Pigs don't just disappear like that, not without a trace. And after hearing Old Man Thompson's story, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. But Jake didn't want to talk about it. He buried himself in farm work like he was trying to pretend everything was normal. But it wasn't. The first time we heard the screams was on the third night after the accident. We had just finished dinner, and Jake was sitting in his usual spot on the couch, flipping through the channels on the TV, when this sound pierced through the quiet. It wasn't an animal sound, not one I'd ever heard before. It was this awful, high-pitched screech like metal scraping against metal, but mixed with something animal. We both froze, staring at each other, neither of us wanting to admit we heard it. But then it came again, louder this time, closer. "Jesus," Jake muttered, getting up from the couch. "What the hell is that?" I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the kitchen table. "I don't know, but it's coming from the woods." Jake grabbed his shotgun, looking tense. We hadn't talked much about what was happening, but I could tell he was starting to feel it too. Something was off, way off. We stepped out onto the porch, and the night hit us like a wall. It was dark, no moon, and the air felt heavy, like a storm was coming. The trees on the edge of the property swayed, but not from the wind, more like something was moving through them. The screech came again, so loud this time it made my ears ring. It was definitely coming from the woods, near where I'd seen that shadow a few nights back. "What do you think it is?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. Jake shook his head, looking out into the darkness. "I don't know. Maybe a coyote? But I've never heard one sound like that." We stood there listening. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. Complete silence, like the whole world had gone dead. Jake lowered the shotgun, but his hands were still tense, his knuckles white. "Whatever it was, it's gone now." "Yeah," I said, but I didn't believe it. I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, lurking just outside the house. Every creak, every rustle of the wind against the window made my skin crawl. And then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it again, the screech. I bolted upright, listening. This time it was faint, like it was farther away, but it was there. I glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. The dogs, which usually slept out in the yard, were barking like crazy now, their howls blending with the screeching. I ran out of my room and down the hall to find Jake already up, shotgun in hand, his face pale. He didn't say a word. He just nodded towards the front door. We both knew what was happening. We stepped out onto the porch again, the night even darker than before. The dogs were losing it, barking and growling like something had them spooked. They were all huddled under the porch, tails between their legs, but their eyes were locked on the tree line. The noise came again, louder, more frantic. It wasn't just a screech anymore. It was like a chorus of high-pitched wails, echoing through the woods. Whatever it was, it sounded angry, desperate. "We gotta check it out," Jake said, his voice tight. "You sure about that?" I asked, gripping the flashlight tighter. "What if it's dangerous?" Jake looked at me, his jaw clenched. "We can't just stay here and do nothing." I didn't argue. I followed him off the porch, my legs shaking as we made our way towards the barn. The air was thick, and the closer we got to the woods, the harder it was to breathe. The flashlight flickered as we walked, casting long, shaky shadows on the ground. When we reached the barn, the screeching stopped again, like someone had flipped a switch. The silence was deafening. Even the dogs had stopped barking, their whimpers barely audible. Jake shined the flashlight towards the woods, but all we could see were the trees, tall and dark, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. "I don't like this," I whispered. Jake didn't answer. He was staring at something near the edge of the woods, his face tense. I followed his gaze, squinting in the dark, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, moving between the trees. It wasn't an animal, not any kind I knew of. It looked almost human, but its movements were wrong. Too fast, too jerky. "Jake," I whispered, my throat dry. "We need to go back." But before he could answer, the screech came again, louder than ever, this time coming from right in front of us. The thing was moving fast, darting through the trees towards us. "Run!" Jake shouted, shoving me towards the house. We sprinted back to the porch, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I could hear the thing behind us, crashing through the trees, that awful screech echoing in my ears. We made it back inside, slamming the door shut behind us. Jake bolted the door, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the lock. We stood there, panting, listening for any sign of it. But the screeching had stopped again. For a few minutes, neither of us said anything. The only sound was our heavy breathing and the occasional whimper from the dogs outside. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked, my voice shaky. Jake just shook his head, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not from around here." We stayed up the rest of the night, keeping watch, but the thing never came back. The dogs eventually calmed down, but they refused to leave the porch. I knew they sensed it too. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't gone for good. As the sun finally started to rise, I felt a sense of relief, like maybe we were safe now that it was daylight. But deep down, I knew better. The thing in the woods wasn't just some wild animal. It was something else, something that wasn't done with us yet. And Rosie was still missing. By the time the fourth night came around, we were both on edge. Neither Jake nor I had slept properly in days, and every night the screeches got worse. I kept telling myself it was just some animal, that maybe we were overreacting, but the truth was I knew something was wrong. And the fact that Rosie was still missing just made it harder to ignore. That evening, things took a turn. I was sitting on the porch, trying to calm my nerves with a cup of coffee, when we heard a knock at the door. It was Clara, the postwoman. She looked pale, her hair messy, like she hadn't slept either. Her hands were shaking as she clutched the door frame, eyes wide like she'd seen a ghost. "You boys heard about the accidents, right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at Jake, who shrugged like he had no idea what she was talking about. "Accidents? 2 in one day," she said, her voice trembling. "One of them was me. I almost crashed my truck into a tree this morning. Swerved to miss something on the road. Something wrong." I stood up, feeling that familiar chill creep up my spine. "What did you see?" Clara hesitated, biting her lip like she didn't want to say it out loud. It was standing in the middle of the road, tall, thin like a shadow, but it wasn't just a shadow. It had eyes, glowing eyes. Jake shook his head, but I could tell he was paying close attention. "Clara, you probably just saw a deer. Lots of them this time of year. And when they get caught in the headlights..." "It wasn't a deer," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "I know what I saw, Jake." I slammed on the brakes, but when I looked up, it was gone. Just gone. I felt my stomach twist. It was the same thing I'd seen by the barn. The same thing Old Man Thompson had described. "And it's not just me," Clara continued, her voice dropping. "I'm not the only one. Old Joe Mason said he saw it too, just before he hit a ditch out on the highway. Said the same thing. Thin, tall, and its eyes were glowing in the dark." Jake rubbed his face, clearly rattled. "This is crazy. It's got to be something else. People are getting worked up over nothing." Clara's eyes locked onto his, fierce and serious. "You think I'd make this up? You think Joe would? Something's out there, Jake. Something's not right." For the first time since this whole thing started, I saw Jake look genuinely worried. He didn't have a snappy comeback or some joke to brush it off. He just nodded and muttered, "We'll keep an eye out." After Clara left, we sat in silence for a long while, neither of us knowing what to say. I could see it on Jake's face. He didn't want to admit it, but he was scared. And so was I. Night came fast, and the wind picked up again, howling like it always did when things started to go bad. The house felt colder than usual, and even though I tried to act like I wasn't scared, my hands were shaking, just holding the flashlight. We stayed inside, curtains drawn, but every once in a while, I'd catch Jake peeking through the blinds, watching the edge of the property, waiting. That's when it happened. It must have been around midnight when we heard it. Tires screeching, the sound of metal crunching, followed by a scream that cut through the silence like a knife. My heart dropped into my stomach. We rushed outside, the cold air biting at our faces as we sprinted down the driveway toward the main road. My mind was racing. Another accident? When we reached the road, I saw the car, a small sedan, turned over on its side, the headlights still flickering. The driver, a young woman, was crawling out of the broken window, blood running down her face. Jake and I ran over, helping her to her feet. She was shaking, sobbing, barely able to stand. What happened? Jake asked, but I could tell he already knew the answer. She wiped at her face, her hands trembling. I saw something in the road. I thought it was a person, but when I got closer, it wasn't. It was too tall, too thin, and its eyes, they were glowing. I finished for her. She nodded, her face pale as a ghost. Jake let out a long breath, looking down the road. All right, we need to get you out of here. You're hurt, and we don't know what's out there. We helped her back to the house, keeping an eye on the woods the whole time. The wind was picking up, and I could swear I heard that screeching again, faint but unmistakable. When we got inside, I locked the door behind us, my heart still racing. Jake was pacing back and forth, muttering under his breath, and the woman, her name was Lisa, sat on the couch, still shaking, her hands wrapped around a cup of water. We can't ignore this anymore, I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence. Whatever's out there, it's not going away. Jake stopped pacing, turning to face me. I know. Those two words hit me harder than anything else. Jake, the guy who had brushed off everything up to this point, was finally admitting something was wrong. What do we do? I asked, my voice low. Jake didn't answer right away. He just stared out the window, his face hard, like he was thinking through every possible option. We wait, he finally said. We wait and see what it wants. Wait! I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Jake, people are getting hurt. We can't just sit here and wait. What do you want me to do? Huh, he snapped, his voice louder than I'd ever heard it. Go out there and shoot at shadows? You saw what happened to Clara. What happened to this girl? Whatever this thing is, it's not something we can just handle like it's a regular animal. He was right, of course. I didn't have an answer. I just knew that sitting in the house, waiting for something terrible to happen, wasn't going to help either. But Jake didn't budge. We'll keep watch tonight. We'll see if it comes back. If it does, we'll deal with it then. And so, we waited. Hours passed. The house silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the sound of the wind howling outside. Every now and then, I'd hear something, maybe a rustle outside, or the dogs whining softly, but I forced myself to stay calm, to not jump at every little sound. And then, just when I thought the night would pass without another incident, I saw it. Through the window, just at the edge of the woods, I saw the shadow again. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still, watching us. Jake, I whispered, barely able to speak. He didn't need to ask what I was talking about. He saw it too. The glowing eyes, piercing through the darkness, locked onto the house. For a long moment, we just stared at it, frozen, waiting for it to make the first move. But it didn't. It just stood there, watching. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished, melting into the darkness like it had never been there at all. Jake let out a shaky breath, his grip tightening on the shotgun. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we're finding out what the hell this thing is. I nodded, my heart still pounding in my chest. Tomorrow, we'd figure it out, because whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. The next morning, neither Jake nor I were in a rush to leave the house. The events of the previous night were still fresh, weighing heavy on both of us. We sat at the kitchen table, the sun barely creeping through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. My head was pounding from lack of sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I could still see that shadow, tall and thin, watching us from the trees. We need to figure this out, Jake finally said, his voice hoarse from a night of tension. I nodded, sipping the bitter coffee that wasn't doing much to wake me up. You think it's Rosie? Jake's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing like he was thinking hard about that. I don't know. I want to say no, but After everything we've seen, I just don't know. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the silence stretching between us. Deep down, I knew we were both thinking the same thing. Something had changed on that farm the night Rosie went missing. And whatever it wasn't something natural. Finally, Jake stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I need to show you something." I raised an eyebrow, following him as he walked out of the kitchen. He didn't say another word as he led me through the house, down the hallway, and out the back door toward the barn. The sun was brighter now, making the air feel a little warmer, but it didn't do much to chase away the chill that had settled deep in my bones. Jake walked straight to the barn door, his steps purposeful, like he knew exactly where he was going. When we stepped inside, the smell of old hay and dust hit me, and I couldn't help but feel that familiar unease creep up my spine. Something about this place had always felt off, even before Rosie disappeared. "You know, my dad used to keep a lot of junk in here," Jake said, his voice quieter now, almost like he didn't want anyone to hear. "After he died, I cleaned most of it out, but there's one thing I never touched." We walked deeper into the barn, past old tools and rusting equipment that hadn't been touched in years. In the far corner, Jake knelt down and started pulling aside some old tarps, revealing a thick wooden trapdoor beneath them. It was weathered, the wood gray and cracked, but the iron hinges were still intact. "What's that?" I asked, my throat dry. Jake didn't answer right away. He just pulled out a small key from his pocket and fitted into the old lock. "It's a cellar. My dad used to keep things down there. Things he didn't want people to know about." I felt my stomach churn as he pushed the trapdoor open, revealing a set of steep stairs leading into the dark. A cold draft hit me, making the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "You sure we should go down there?" I asked, my voice shaky. Jake nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "We need to. There's something you need to see." He grabbed a flashlight from the workbench and started down the steps. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with all the possibilities of what could be down there. But I followed him. I had to. There was no turning back now. The cellar was colder than I expected, and as we descended, the air became damp and musty. The stairs creaked under our weight, and the beam of the flashlight danced across the stone walls, casting eerie shadows that made my skin crawl. At the bottom, the room opened up into a small, square space. It was lined with shelves full of old glass jars, dusty books, and strange metal tools I didn't recognize. But what caught my eye was the center of the room, a large metal cage, rusted and empty but still intact. Thick, broken chains lay scattered on the ground, and in the corner, there were deep scratch marks, as if something had tried to claw its way out. "What the hell is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jake didn't look at me. His eyes were locked on the cage, his face pale. My dad was experimenting on animals, trying to change them, make them stronger, smarter. He called it advancement. He thought he could create something better than nature, something superior. My stomach twisted as the pieces started falling into place. "And Rosie?" Jake finally turned to me, his face grim. "She was his last experiment." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. Rosie wasn't just a pig. She was something else, something his dad had tried to alter. And now she was out there, changed, twisted into something unnatural. "I didn't know," Jake continued, his voice full of regret. "I didn't know what he was doing until after he died. I found his notes, his journals. He kept it all hidden down here. And by the time I realized, it was too late. Rosie had already changed. I thought I could handle it, keep her locked up, but she got loose." I felt my heart racing in my chest, my thoughts spinning out of control. "So, the thing we've been seeing, the screeching, the accidents, it's Rosie?" Jake nodded, his face hardening. "I think so. I didn't want to believe it at first, but now I know. Whatever she's become, it's because of my dad's experiments. And it's my fault she's still out there." The room felt colder, the silence heavier as we both stood there, staring at the cage, at the chains. It was starting to make sense now. The screeches, the shadows, the glowing eyes. Rosie wasn't just missing. She had transformed into something else entirely, something dangerous. "We need to stop her," Jake said suddenly, his voice firm, "before someone else gets hurt." I didn't argue. I couldn't. I knew he was right. Whatever Rosie had become, we had to put an end to it. But how do you stop something that's no longer just an animal? Something that's part of the dark, twisted experiments of a man who is playing God? We need a plan, I muttered, trying to think, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Jake was already ahead of me. We track her down. She's been coming to the farm, right? We set a trap. We lure her back here, and we finish this. And if she doesn't come back? Jake's eyes met mine, full of grim determination. She will. Trust me, she'll come back. She always does. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't have a better idea. The truth was out now, and there was no going back. Whatever Rosie had become, it was because of Jake's dad, and now it was up to us to stop her. As we climbed back up the stairs and into the daylight, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what we were about to face. This wasn't just a pig gone wild. This was something much worse. And deep down, I knew that no matter what happened next, things would never be the same again. That evening, the air felt different, heavier, like a storm was building even though the sky was clear. Jake and I worked in silence, preparing for what we both knew was going to be the longest night of our lives. After what he'd shown me in the cellar, there was no more denying the truth. Rosie wasn't just a missing pig. She was something far more dangerous, something twisted by his father's experiments. And now she was coming back. Jake's plan was simple, but desperate. He was going to use bait to lure her in, fresh meat and some of the feed she used to love. The idea was to trap her in the barn, using the same chains that once held her down in the cellar. But this time, we'd be ready to finish it for good. We reinforced the barn doors, locking them up tight, and scattered the bait just inside, near the entrance. The air reeked of it, thick and putrid, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was really going to work. Could we even trap her? Was she still an animal, or had she become something too smart, too dangerous for us to control? The sun began to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the farm. I could feel the tension building in my chest, the fear creeping up my spine as the last of the daylight faded. The dogs, which had been keeping close to the house all day, were nowhere to be seen now. Even they had retreated, sensing the danger in the air. Jake stood by the barn door, his shotgun in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. "You ready?" he asked, his voice low, almost hollow. I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight tighter. Ready as I'll ever be. We settled into position, hiding just behind the barn where we had a clear view of the entrance. The trap was set, and all we had to do now was wait. The night dragged on, the hours creeping by slower than I thought possible. Every rustle of the wind, every creak of the barn made my heart jump. I could feel my nerves fraying, my pulse quickening as the silence stretched on. I kept glancing over at Jake, but he was focused, his face set like stone, barely blinking. It must have been well past midnight when we finally heard it, that familiar, gut-wrenching screech echoing through the night. It was far off at first, distant and faint, but it was coming closer, getting louder with each passing minute. The dogs started barking wildly, their howls frantic and scared, but they didn't come anywhere near the barn. They knew better. Jake tensed, his grip tightening on the shotgun. "She's coming," he whispered, barely audible. I nodded, my mouth dry as I switched on the flashlight, shining it toward the barn entrance. My hands were shaking, but I tried to steady them, tried to focus on the task at hand. This was it. Then from the trees, I saw her. The shape was unmistakable, taller than before, thinner, but still moving with that eerie, jerking gait that didn't belong to any animal I knew. Her eyes glowed in the darkness, too bright, piercing orbs that sent chills down my spine. "Stay calm," Jake muttered, but I could hear the tremor in his voice too. Rosie moved slowly, almost cautiously, her head turning toward the barn as if she knew exactly what was waiting for her. The screeches had stopped now, replaced by a low, guttural growl that rumbled deep in her throat. She was close enough now that I could see the outlines of her ribs through her thin, stretched skin, her body no longer resembling the animal she once was. She was something else now, something far more terrifying. She stopped at the entrance to the barn, sniffing the air, her glowing eyes flicking back and forth between the bait and the barn itself. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. This was it. If she took the bait, we'd have her. Come on, I begged silently, my palms slick with sweat. Just go inside. For a moment, it seemed like she might turn away, like she'd sensed the trap. But then, with one quick movement, she darted forward, disappearing into the barn. Now! Jake yelled, sprinting toward the door. We rushed forward, slamming the doors shut behind her, locking them tight with the heavy iron chains we'd prepared earlier. Rosie was inside, trapped. The barn shook as she threw herself against the doors, screeching in rage, her massive body slamming into the walls hard enough to make the wood creak and groan. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins as I backed away, my hands shaking. "We got her!" I shouted, barely believing it. But Jake didn't celebrate. His face was pale, his eyes wide as he stared at the barn, listening to the furious sounds coming from inside. "It's not over," he said quietly. "Not yet." He grabbed the shotgun, moving toward the door. "We need to end this now." "Jake," I said, my voice trembling. "Are you sure? She's trapped." "Maybe." But he cut me off, his voice firm. "No. This thing, whatever she's become, we can't leave her like this. It's not safe." I nodded, following him to the door. My stomach twisted with fear, but I knew he was right. We couldn't leave her in there. She'd break out eventually, and when she did, who knows what kind of destruction she'd cause. Jake unlatched the door, just enough to push it open a crack. Inside, the barn was dark, except for the faint glow of Rosie's eyes reflecting off the flashlight beam. She was still, her body heaving with deep, ragged breaths, as if she was waiting for us to make the first move. I could feel the weight of the moment, the finality of it all pressing down on me. This was it, the moment we had to face the truth. Rosie wasn't just an animal anymore. She was something else, something beyond our control, and we had to put an end to it. Jake lifted the shotgun, taking aim. "Sorry, girl," he whispered, his voice full of sorrow. "But this is the only way." But just as he was about to pull the trigger, Rosie moved. Not toward us, no. She backed away, deeper into the shadows of the barn, as if she understood what was happening, as if she knew. And in that moment, something changed. The glow in her eyes dimmed, the rage and ferocity fading, replaced by something else, something almost human. Jake hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. "What the hell?" Then it hit me. The experiments. Jake's father hadn't just changed Rosie's body. He'd done something far worse. He'd altered her mind. Whatever she had become, she wasn't just a creature anymore. She was part of something else, something that had once been aware, alive. I grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him back. "No," I said, my voice shaking. "We can't." He looked at me confused. "What do you mean?" "We have to. She's still in there," I whispered, my heart pounding. "Some part of her. She knows. Look at her." Jake stared into the barn, his face twisted in disbelief. But then, slowly, he lowered the gun. He saw it too. The creature in the barn wasn't just a monster. She was still Rosie, some part of her at least. For a long moment, we stood there, the barn silent except for the sound of her breathing. Then, without warning, she turned and ran, bursting through the back of the barn, tearing through the walls and disappearing into the night. Jake and I stood there, frozen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us like a ton of bricks. She was gone. We hadn't killed her, but we'd seen something we couldn't explain, something that defied reason. "We should have ended it," Jake muttered, his voice hollow. But deep down, I knew we couldn't have. Rosie wasn't just a creature of flesh and bone anymore. She was something far more complicated, something that might never be fully understood. And now she was out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting. The farm was quiet that night, the air still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And even though Rosie was gone, I knew one thing for certain. She'd be back. But when she did, things would never be the same again.